mean? What should we think about it? Alexander will tell us in the next 40 minutes. Thank you. Please welcome.
Thank you very much, Mitya. Thank you for coming, and I'm really pleased and honored to be the first guest lecturer in this welcoming space. Meanwhile, the topic is not that pleasant, and I'd like to discuss with you some points which seem to me very relevant in order to better explain the way the Russian government, the Russian institutional order came to the war and arrived to the to restart the war. And I would like to start with a point which is highly mediatically widespread and which concerns the inexplicable character of the current war. No economic rationality, no interest might justify the invasion of the Russian army to the Ukrainian territory. And from the point of view of liberal economy, I admit this is completely true. There is no explanation of any interest, income, or profit which might be behind this military invasion. But what if the point is less relevant to the economic goals understood in the framework of the liberal economy, but mostly the territory? If the territory itself is the interesting object of the Russian invasion. For example, the pipes which are situated on the Ukrainian territory might be an interesting resource, in some extent notwithstanding the immediate economic result of its exploitation. Getting access and getting the monopoly of some particular or exclusive territorial resource might be one of the reasons why the war started. This is not a well-justified sentence. It's just a hypothesis. But if we go further to the idea of what colonial war might mean in current conditions, quite recently we hear the voices of the oppressed Ukrainian population, which considers this war as a completely insane, death-oriented politics, which aims to suppress and to exteriorate the Ukrainian population. But from the point of view of classical colonial invasion, the aim is not there and might be different from the very beginning of the military campaign of the Russian government. Because if we look in the history of in the recent history of the colonial appropriations, we may find, for example, a very clearly speaking example of the General Gallieni, who was the French general organizing and coordinating the invasion to Madagascar. And in his writings, he insists on the fact that colonial policy must not use the army as the main mean of destruction. The population should not be distracted, the territory should not be distracted, and neither economic facilities should not be distracted. On the contrary, the military power is used in order to seize the territory, in order to regroup the population. And one of the aims of the colonial administration, following Gallieni's word in the late 19th century in France, was to make a selection of the loyal population on which the colonial administration may count in order to produce goods and to export them to the territory of the metropolis, and to suppress the bad population. So a certain kind of categorization, a certain type of machinery was installed in Madagascar, but it was a more general colonial policy to create this type of administration, which would manage and administer the territory and the population in the way that it might serve the metropole. So the colonial war, if we consider it seriously, is something which has a rationality behind it. And this rationality is not just the humiliation and the destruction of the enemy population. It is more relevant to the territory, which is considered as a good in itself. It is more relevant to the population, which is considered as a resource of productivity, but also as a resource in itself, including the demographic capacity of this population to be imported to the territory of the metropole and to populate the depopulated regions, for example. And this also concerns the growing autonomy or sovereignization of the metropole in the context where the colony supplies goods and resources to it. So if we take this angle of view, I would say that Russian invasion becomes not a bit more acceptable, but at least less inclined to the insanity dimension, which is very often used in order to speak publicly and to explain the reasons of the invasion. So my task today is to try to reconstruct the elements of this rationality, which are not only cultural, which are not only the mindsets governing the Kremlin corridors. I'm not at all an expert in criminology, and I cannot imagine what happens in Vladimir Putin's head. What interests me most, this is how some objective factors, some institutional shifts arrived, which prepared the soil of such a rationality, which considers Ukraine and some other territories as a possible plot of colonial invasion and of resource exploitation in favor of the depopulating Russia. I would like first to show you a kind of short, but in fact long, but still very much shortened list of the dilemma of the problem we have to deal with when we speak, when we reflect, when we discuss the evolution of the Russian state. I would say that what you see in the left part of this table is something which benefits of a high mediatic coverage and which gives the core definition of what the Russian state is. So mostly this is the criticism of some governmental activities which aim to reconstruct some neo-traditional public order, mostly in the cultural, but also in the human rights sectors, which affect the image of the Russian state as going with high step to the authoritarian rule and to the dictatorship. It is not at all false from this point of view, but if we look in the right side of this table, you will see that there is a kind of second history of the Russian state coming from the early 2000s, and which is not at all covered in the same way in the media, which is not at all discussed in the same way, and which reflects quite a different dynamics. If the first column, the neo-traditionalist trends in the Russian government and institutional design consider mostly the freedoms, so they are elaborated and operated mostly by the liberal opposition and journalists. This part of the list, which considers even deeper maybe changes in the institutional design, because they consider larger groups of population, the whole categories like poor people, like those who collaborate with the state, having budget salaries, and some other important core categories of maintaining the institutional order. You will see that this is mostly the issue which is operated by small independent trade unions, by small unorthodox leftist groups, by the international cultural mostly artistic milieu, so that the image of the Russian regime, which is only based on this neo-traditionalist agenda, I would say remains half reflected or cut in half, because the other part of this evolution covers very well recognizable neoliberal trends, which you also find in Germany, in the United States, in Japan, and through all over the world. So from this point of view, I would insist on the fact that there are some elements of the institutional order which are present in the Russian institutional design, in part projected, in part just adopted from the international agenda of interministerial commissions, of the conventions the Russian government signed from the 90s, which install not only neo-traditionalist agenda, anti-human rights, anti-LGBTQ, anti-fascist, and colonial in an explicit way in 2014, but also the quite universalist, in some extent, neoliberal agenda, which is as old as the early 2000s. And if you see well the list, the measures which consider these social equality and social justice issues were really deep and heavy already at that moment. So I would like to show you one example of how these two trends interlace and coexist in different projects of institutional construction, taking as an example a very important field or sector of institutional population management, which is the educational policy. So you might know that the end of the 2000s was marked by the project of creating of so-called federal super universities, which were destined to fuse several regional universities to invest more resources in the creation of huge campuses of super visible and super productive university units, which would enter the international rankings, including the Shanghai rating and some other ones. So from one point of view, that was a clearly neoliberal project, which was targeting visibility, productivity, and also autonomy, including the financial dimension of the autonomy, which was imposed progressively to the university sector in Russia, starting from the 2000s. But there was a quite intriguing dimension of this project, because if you look on the map of the universities which are distributed on the territory, you may ask a question like, okay, there are some choices which were taken in order to create the university infrastructure, like new campuses. Okay, maybe this is like rentability, the high or lower rent for constructing campuses, etc., which played the role. But still, if you put the map of the newly created universities, of the far of the important investment project of the Russian government in the late 2000s and early 2010, you will find that putting it on the map of the density of the population in Russia, you kind of discover that not all the universities, and maybe most of them, are not constructed in a way in compliance with the neoliberal agenda. Because the neoliberal way of projecting a university would be to put it where the highest demand on the university or educational services exists. Meanwhile, what you see here is, at least in the eastern part of the map, is a complete different picture, because the universities in a very low densely populated regions, which are invested in the same level as the more central ones. So this is a kind of anomaly, but it's not just a vagary. It's a serious project. It's kind of a well thought politics. And one of the explanations why the part of the universities and maybe the explanation of the whole geographical distribution, spatial distribution of the universities in the Russian territory is well explained in the doctrine, which was published in 2008 or 2009, and which explains that these projects of federal universities are not, in fact, intended to serve only neoliberal visibility and ranking target. The mission of this university was tightly connected with the security, with the national security. And like asking yourself what kind of security issue might the university resolve, you discover that the doctrine explains that the security assured by the universities is the territorial integrity and demographic integrity of the Russian plot. And the university constructed in these regions should create a so-called security belt of the Russian territory. So once you read the security belt in the doctrine, you better understand why they are almost all peripheral. So these universities should defend, in some extent, from the invasion from the east. Those universities should protect the territory from the southern invasion, and Kaliningrad University should be the outpost of the defense of the Russian territory from the west. So it looks a bit kind of, once again, ridiculous if it was not that serious. And this is a very high-crime example of how it worked. And in many documents of the doctrinal and institutional kind throughout the 2010, we find the same entanglement, the same combination of neoliberal investment into institutional infrastructure, into visibility, into high competition, into individualization and financial autonomization of the universities. And it's also 2010 when these law 83 is adopted, which pushes the universities and other public institutions to sell their services as free market commodities. But the dimension which remains as important as the neoliberal one is to assure the integrity of the territory and to transform cultural institution into security commodities or into security instruments of the territorial integrity. So from this point of view, just like who adopts these kind of projects? I would like to propose to you a brief overview of how the several Russian ministries and key institutions of government were designed starting from the early 2000s. And here I just give you an example of the Ministry of Finance. Then with some institution which is not a ministry, but you all know that this is highly important in the governmental design of how the power is constructed in the Russian state. So this is the presidential administration, and the first deputy chief of staff is someone who is charged with ideology. And the other one, which is not ministerial, but also important, is kind of shadow management of public sphere, which was delegated or committed to several persons, which we find with their characteristics, both social, professional, and political, which speak quite brightly about how the shift was operated. So first of all, the finance, Alexei Kudrin, who was the minister of Putin's administration from the very early 2000s, you might know him all, that he is a liberal economist and public figure, and he was quite varying. He was varying his career in different types of institutions, and he never denied his agency as someone who insisted on economic policy. So he was one who was proposing different strong measures to maintain Russian economy, as compared to his successor, Anton Siluanov, who is, as you see in the short overview, a kind of ministry guy. So he was always making his career within the Ministry of Finance, starting from the senior expert position, making a progressive career. So from this point of view, we may conclude, or we may hypothesize that starting from the 2011, what is happening in the finance and economy is much less autonomous as for the liberal policy imposed by strong figure, public and economic figure or expert figure in the government, but is more is highly subject to the already established scheme and the presidential administration, which is in turn governed or headed by different types of administrators, and opposing Vladislav Surkov as the head of the ideology production in Russia, who was quite clearly Western-oriented analyst and manipulator, who imagined and invented this so-called sovereign democracy and the managed opposition. Alexei Gromov was once again a guy within the office. He was always making his career after he finished quite early his diplomacy career. He was making the press secretary of president and of prime minister when Putin took this office. So he is the man of Putin, of Vladimir Putin, as opposed to Vladislav Surkov, who was also, for example, the man of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, then the man of the management group of Alfa Bank, Transneft Product, and some others. So he didn't change Gromov, he didn't change too much his position. This is a loyal figure, as well as Anton Siluanov is more loyal figure than Alexei Kudrin. And finally, the same, like not really the same, but a similar or homologous shift happens in the management of public spin doctrine, if we may say it like that, because one of the key figures who was organizing the shadow management of public sphere was Gleb Pavlovsky, once again, very internationally oriented, the king of Slavoj Žižek, the publisher of intellectual literature, and the creator of a highly manipulative foundation of efficient policy, where he recruited mostly the alumni of philosophical departments of Moscow State University. Meanwhile, Evgeny Prigozhin, who took his position without for sure taking his office, was a kind of the opposite, the entrepreneur, the businessman of the anonymous manipulation through commentaries in public media and social network, who was making his career in the shadow of the institutions, and who was gaining public attention only in the 2 last years of his, how to say it, of his being in life, at least in public life. So once again, if we look at the shifts which happen in the administration, we may find quite easily that 2011, 2012 is the real turning point of how the administration is made, or who makes the administration of the Russian state. Here I took several other positions which come to the social bloc. So they are the ministers of education, healthcare, labor and social security, culture, and construction. And I just counted first how many of ministers of 10 had the specific education or professional profile. So only 3. And they were in the healthcare and labor and culture. And the culture, like the specific or dedicated culture profile, finished already in 2008. And then more general or shifted competences were invested in these institutional projects. Meanwhile, those who represent business habitus, those who brought the business incentive and who privatized or re-privatized the state apparatus, not maybe or necessarily in favor of their own pocket or clan, but just implemented some business models in the state institutional design, as you see, they are most part of the ministers. So what we observe on the way of the transformation of the Russian government is the implementation of business experience accumulated in the 90s. And we all remember what kind of business experience it is. It's not at all highly regulated, wide and well-documented business. It's just kind of very unsecure, very risky and violent correlated business. So these people who survived, who were successful in this era, are reinvesting their competences in the state apparatus, once again, I repeat it, not in the Ministry of Finance or Economics, but in the social bloc of the ministries, in culture, in education, in labor and security. So from this point of view, what is important, I don't enter into detail of these institutional shifts, but what is happening in the end of 2011 and then in the early 2012, well, almost all the ministries changed. All the personnel of the highest high-ranking personnel of the ministries shifted or replaced with the new figures, is a progressive or maybe quite explicit substitution of West-oriented, international-oriented expertise and one kind of manipulation, which is based mostly on philosophy, on the interest to the international role of Russia, even though this international role might be considered as illusory, with those who mostly bring the sovereignist or nationalist or these kinds of closed type agendas, which are mostly focused on the territory, which are promoting measures directed to the population in terms of its demographic value and not in terms of its competence. And the point of these changes is not just like investing capitalism into the state, investing new competences, quite problematic ones, in this one. But also, if you remember the right part of the table with the neoliberal shift in the institutional design, you might better understand who are those who implement these measures. They're not just people who accept, for example, international conventions or European or American pressure in institutional homogenization. These are people who are mostly quite sincerely convinced that private is better. And they implement the competition inequalities and quite, how to say it, unhuman way of managing the population and mostly the fragile and problematic and vulnerable categories in quite a sincere way as businessmen do. So what happens in the way of this management? One of the key questions: what for all that is made for, is done? The key answer of this to this question is productivity, because productivity is the one of the goals, one of the targets of the neoliberal reforms. For example, you might remember the echo of discussions brought first by Vladimir Putin, then by Dmitry Medvedev, that Russian employees produce much less than European or American ones. And it's true that the productivity is tightly correlated with the goals of institutional management of the population. And here I just took the OECD statistics, which show that until 2008, more or less, the productivity in Russia was growing in a higher speed, better than afterwards. First, the factor which was explaining, which may explain the lower rate of the productivity is the international financial crisis, which happened in 2010. And you see that in almost every case, except the United States, in kind of inexplicable, at least on the surface, inexplicable manner, the productivity in 2010, for example, has also the negative gap in Europe in 2008, 2010. But then in European countries and in the United States, the growth continues. Meanwhile, in Russian economy, the productivity kind of stagnates until the war in Ukraine, the first war, the annexation of Crimea, 2014. And then it makes some steps, but they are all more or less within the range of a mild growth, or better to say, the positive or the optimist stagnation. And this is quite interesting from the point of view of the politics which was implemented by those people who came to the ministries. So you saw that 2011, more or less, this is the time of stagnating productivity, which doesn't grow really much. And from this point of view, we need some more explanation why this happened. So one of the explanation consists in the fact that the financial goal of Russian government, including the one by Alexei Kudrin, was to reduce the external state debt of the Russian Federation, the goal which was more or less accomplished by the 2010-2011, and which did not change really dramatically with the annexation of Crimea, which means that the resources to invest in the Crimea were not taken from the international economy, from the international financial institutions, but mostly from the internal sources. And we all know at least one source of that, that was the so-called cumulative part of the pensions. But that was not the only one. So you see that this was one of the main economic goals of the Russian financial policy, to reduce, or if possible, to cut completely the external state debt. And it was quite successful. And the key engineer of this sovereignist idea, like protecting the Russian economy from the risks associated with the high external debt, was not at all a traditionalist, was not at all a neo-conservative person, but Alexei Kudrin in person himself, who was a liberal economist and who was projecting the specific liberal economy of the Russian state. The other point, which is really important and which is kind of hidden and might seem a like nasty secret of any contemporary state, is the gold stock of the Russian Federation. As you see, it starts growing from the same moment from which the productivity starts stagnating. It's 2008, when Alexei Kudrin, the same liberal economist and the Minister of Finance, implements the instrument of sovereign funds, which is aimed to protect the Russian economy from the further international economic crises. So in this way, the Russian golden reserve, I mean the physical gold, not investment into different types of currencies in international banks, but physical gold, start being stocked in high quantity in the reserve, in the cellars of the Bank of the Russian Federation. And as you see, the growth of its content, of its weight, continues until 2020, where it touches almost its maximum level, and it's higher or weightier than in 2008, 6 times. So it's a huge difference, especially if we look in the economies of the other countries, including Germany, France, etc. The gold stock is stagnating throughout 2000 and 2010. And it was a crucial moment, the COVID epidemics, where the debate was started about if the gold in the physical gold in the national banks may be a good answer to the lowering capacity of national economies to respond to the COVID crisis. And the answer was no, because the gold is associated with the sovereignty of national currencies in the model, which is the complete opposite to the liberal economy and free exchange, and which is called mercantilism. So the gold is one of the fetishes and one of the key values of mercantilist policy, which aims to stabilize the national wealth through acquisitions of territories, through acquisitions of positive trade balance, and through the stock of some kind of universalist, eternal value, which may assure the sovereignty of the national currency. As you see, invented as a measure of anti-crisis safety, institutional design, economic design in 2008, the golden stock and some other instruments of sovereign stability of the economic start playing quite a special role from 2014. So 2014 is not at all a break in this dynamic. On the contrary, it's just a small point, a small dynamic point, which accelerates the acquisition of gold, which was, among other means, taken by Yevgeny Prigozhin, ЧВК Wagner in Congo and Sudan, illegitimately, but also legitimately, and brought as counterfeit weight with the planes going to Moscow and St. Petersburg. So the ways to fill in the golden stock of the Russian Federation was realized kind of fetishist way. And this corresponds quite well with the financial autonomization of the paying system MIR, which was established in 2014 and which was getting the growing autonomy of the Russian territory. So by the beginning of the Second Ukrainian War, it was almost done. The golden stock was really high. It's one of the highest among the national golden stocks. The United States still have 3 times more than Russia in the cellars of the National Reserve of the United States. But still, if we look at the dynamics, the growth of the golden stock in Russia was the highest. Then the trade balance, which may seem quite paradoxical from some extent, in some extent, because you see that the Russian trade balance, so the prevalence of the importation of the sold goods in the international market as compared to the acquired or bought goods, is always positive from the early 90s. But as you see, it's growing not only in the pre-war period, and there is kind of failure, not in 2014, but later in 2018. What is more paradoxical that 2022 and following some estimations, 2003 too, are the years of the highest trade balance in the Russian economy. And this means that what is happening now in Russia, at least if it was not considered, if it was not conceived as the main tool of fulfillment of mercantilist policy, facilitates quite heavily the realization of this goal. In the lower part of the table, you may see the trade balance of the economy of the United States, and you see that it's always negative. And this doesn't mean that the United States like losing its dominance in the free market. It means that it benefits from the model of the free market, of the free exchange. Meanwhile, the positive trade balance of the Russian Federation corresponds quite well, correlates quite well with the accumulation of sovereign resources and quite successful realization of this policy. And this policy is called normally, I mean, historically, it's called mercantilism. And I took this definition from the Britannica, which is not a highly academic source, but still quite a good source, resuming some research about the history of economies and of political history. And we find in this definition all the elements of what now is happening in Russian economy, like profiting for the economy, for the economical growth from the other countries, the export which exceeds the imports, and this is the positive trade balance which continues to grow in the Russian economy, and accumulate the wealth in the form of gold and silver, which is also something which is happening in the Russian economy which has been happening since 2008. And once again, if we consider these instruments which were first conceived as in Russian economy by Alexei Kudrin and his office, by some other economists which were quite interested not in expansion of Russian economy at the expense of other countries, but mostly in the protection of the Russian economy from the negative effects of the crisis, of the international crisis. We just cannot kind of make a hypothesis, kind of Machiavellian one, that Kudrin was already in charge of the war started. Still, these instruments of economic security were mutated through the decade of 2010s, and we find that the same sovereign funds, the same gold stock, the same elements of financial sovereignty which were implemented in 2014 with the system, with the paying system MIR and some other instruments, are now serving quite a different objective, quite a different target of governmental action. So in this sense, the neoliberal instruments of management, of economy, of the population mutate in some extent. They transform themselves into the new mercantilist tools of governmental policy. And this is what is happening in the Russian institutional structures, in the Russian institutional model, at least starting from the 2017. I think that I'm just run out of the time, and I had a very important part, not this one, still, yes. This represents how the turning point was orchestrated when Vladimir Putin made a coup d'etat, breaking with the collegiality of his government and putting to distance not only Macron or some foreign counterparts, but also his own government, and creating this or recreating this mercantilism which existed in the economic form. He recreated it in the military form. But the most important point which I would like to underline is, thank you, is the fact that during several decades, the Russian economy, but also the Russian institutional management of the population, of the public sphere, of the state service was neoliberal, not only in terms of the implemented measures, but also in terms, for example, of management the population of the state. You may see that there was a period which finished more or less in the mid of 2010s, where when the body of civil servants, but also of the police and of the army, and I mean the main body, not all the participants of the institutions, were reduced. So that was the model of cutting off the government, of making less government, which is a neoliberal doctrine of the state, which might be operated more efficiently following the model of private institution. So flexible, responsive, more competent, and that was the era when even the police ranks was cut off. As compared, by the way, to some of the comments of experts who look at general numbers, saying, no, look, the bureaucracy in Russia had always the tendency to grow. No, there were service positions in the bureaucratic institutions, which were kind of boosting the whole, the total numbers. But if we look at the core of civil service and also of the violence institutions, we see a clear tendency of lowering or cutting, so which corresponds quite well with the neoliberal one. But from the 2017, more or less 16, 17, this is the counter tendency which establishes itself, and it is implemented both in concomitance, in coordination with this economic drift, with the economic dynamics of the growing golden stock, of the sovereignization of economy, of the installed models of so-called importozamещения, the replacement, the sovereign replacement of goods, of international goods with the internal market produced ones. But that's also the growing part of the police, of the army, and the last but not the least of the private companies, private security companies, which are not directly associated with the state or with the institutional management of the population, but which also assure the task of violent order maintainment in Russia. So I think I would prefer to stop here, even though there are some effects which I'd like to show as per the population in the context of the war. But I prefer to give place, to give floor to the discussion, and if the question raises of the consequences, I would like to follow up this part of my presentation within the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Alexander. Now we have some time, like 20-25 minutes for the discussion. I'll just open it on behalf of the institution, since like we try to come up with some global ideas and global solutions. I want to, I would say to ask you, how can we put that neo-mercantilist trend, which is basically an isolationist, protectionist, etc., in more global perspective? Because on the one hand, I have a feeling that, well, Russia is not alone in neo-mercantilist policy, and at the same time in a kind of regressive imperialist endeavor. So many economists name China as basically like the most systematic model of neo-mercantilist trend in economics and politics. And at the same time, we have trends when the neoliberal economies that still remain neoliberal in orientation of the micro and macro level. They play out this nationalist game that was presented by you as a sort of ideological shift within Russian politics at around 2011. So, like, my question would be, how do we situate that specific case with other sort of turbulences on the ideological and political economical level that play out after the financial crisis? By that I mean like specific authoritarian ideological turn of neoliberal regimes themselves, especially when you see like Trumpism, Bolsonarism, etc. And on the other hand, like how does it relate to neo-mercantilist trends and this sort of imperialist agenda?
Thank you very much, Mitya, for this question. I find it really important because it lies on the main line of the analysis. And I would say that what we observe in other national economies of the global south is, for example, the same trend to collect or to stock the gold in its material form. And this is more or less what is happening not only in China but also in the South America, in the growing economies of the South Asia, and this is something which makes the same game as the Russian government, like assuring the sovereignty of national currencies and national economies. But what happens in the global north for the moment? I checked thoroughly if European banks or financial institutions are interested to play the same game. For the moment, it's not the case. And this is quite interesting because finally, the European and especially the American conservatism is still based on the idea of the free exchange and liberal economy, including the Trump one. I mean, he might be the poorest of the conspiracy leaders, but he still insists on the fact that the free trade and the free exchange of human labor and of goods should be maintained within the system where the American dominance is kept. So from this point of view, I would say that this is a dividing line between the economies which invest, or the economists and the governments which invest in the free trade model and which expect to keep their dominant positions within it. And the game of autonomization, of economic autonomization through sovereignization, through the mercantilization of economic and financial instruments, which is mostly focused in the global south. I would say that doesn't deliver us from further questions about the repressive side or repressive effects of the neoliberal model, which we all observe in the sphere of social inequalities, including the European societies and the American one. And at some point, this resurrects the question about the destiny, the collective destiny of the new proletarian milieu, of the new proletarian class, or the classes of the new precariat, which are already discussed in the political economy, at least, which has been discussed at least for the last 10 years. But still, I would say that from the point of view of the structuring of the international scene, there is a clear division, at least for the moment, where some of the countries of some of the national economies resist, mostly through their dominant actors and operators, to enter the mercantilist model, to enter the mercantilist mode. Meanwhile, some others go quite evident steps toward that, and which means also that Russian government has more understanding, not only in ideological terms, but also in economic terms, with those economies who also accumulate gold stock, who also try to sovereignize national currencies, etc. But what is also important from this point of view is the role which the neo-traditionalist or neo-conservative ideologies were serving in these countries, in these societies. As for Trump, as for Netherlands' actual neoconservatism, as for German neoconservatives, we see quite little of the traditionalist appeals, for example, to the religion or to the, how to say it, limiting models of sexual or reproductive units, even though Trump is more close from this point of view to Vladimir Putin. But what is more important from the point of view of the population management is that the traditionalist agenda was serving in Russia and Saudi Arabia, in Poland, in China, and some other societies, the role of the new spirit of capitalism. It was making more acceptable or easily acceptable the evolution, the imposition of capitalist rules of the game. And this is something which, at my point of view, replies to your question about the further evolution of these instruments from the 2000 to 2015, 2017. The traditionalist agenda was serving kind of a secondary or functional or instrumental tool of maintaining the loyalty of the population. Starting from that point, with the accumulated gold stock, with the sovereignized financial system in Russia, the traditionalist agenda, the conservative way of thinking security issues took over the neoliberal ones. So it was a kind of reversal of the goal and the tool. The tool took over the goal. So the instrumental and secondary security measures became the main agenda of the Russian government.
Okay, thank you. I think so to the question.
I have a question which exactly enters this point where you say that the two became the goal. So it is from a purely analytical, purely rational point understandable to pursue a policy of imperialism for a country, because exploitation of other countries can lead to richness of the core population. But the question is, why would we pursue a mercantilist imperialist policy instead of a capitalist imperialist policy? Because historical experience says that mercantilistic empires tended to fail and quite badly. For example, the Spanish overseas empire, for example, the first French colonial empire, all of them collapsed. Meanwhile, the probably most successful overseas colonialist empire, the British one, was quite obviously capitalist in its outset and brought much more richness to the core country than its mercantilist predecessors.
Could you precise how long the Spanish, French, and British colonial mercantilism existed?
So, I am not really sure how exactly you can date it. You can say that the Spanish empire, I don't know, it started maybe 150, maybe 200 years.
That's it.
So the French one lasted shorter. Meanwhile, the British Empire began its existence only shortly after the Spanish one and persisted until the centuries, or until last century, sorry.
That's it. That's a good answer, but still the answer about the Spanish mercantilist and colonial empire was a good one. 200 years, that's huge amount of years, which I think the Kremlin government just doesn't count. So the idea of mercantilist policy, which kind of constellating in the Kremlin's corridors, is not something which is calculated in the same way as an entrepreneur, a businessman, calculates his profit for the 5 or next 10 or maybe 20 years. The idea is that the Russian government was more and more cautious about long-term planning, or at least provision, but what they visibly predicted is that the productivity growth is not sufficient in order to fulfill the intensive economic development. And one of the replies, kind of once again rational replies in short term to this problem, was to restart the mercantilist policy, or at least to use the outfits of the previous phase or previous era of economic investment and security assurance in order to restart the new policy, which could be a break, quite a visible break from the other international competitors. So to start the own game, right? And this is also one of the explanations why the Russian army activities and also the whole strategy of the Russian invasion looks so archaic, right? This is an explanation which means that we do not wish to play the game of the free trade because we are losing in this game. We're not going to invest in the intensification of labor production because it's not growing as we expected it to be. So what we're going to do, and the most problematic part of this is us. Who are we, right? Is to step back, to make one or two steps back, and to restart the very efficient in short term policy of reacquisition of territories, of accumulating the wealth of the nation through gold, imported population, and violently reappropriated resources. But what is most important maybe in this story is that the turning point when Vladimir Putin personally isolated himself. I think that paradoxically, the COVID epidemic was the key moment when he really broke with his government. So many indices coming from journalists and international observers indicate the fact that before, for example, in the governmental discussions, Putin, before 2020, he was leaving space, leaving floor to his ministers and experts to speak about the particular sectorial activities, the particular issue in the economy, etc. And then he was speaking like resuming. So it's a very Soviet collegial structure of governmental communication where the president makes kind of the final decision on the well-prepared soil. And in this sense, the Soviet doesn't mean bad. What happened in 2020, Putin started the measures of distanciation, isolation, the reducing part of the functionaries and experts could have access to his body, to his room, but also the style of the governmental communication changed quite dramatically. He stopped listening to his ministers and to the experts. He started imposing his ideas. And this is something which reflects quite well the idea that one leader may restart the game, the world game from zero. I think this is something quite fundamental together with his interest in alternative Russian history and some other points of his worldview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you very much. On that point that was raised about what happened in 2020, because I'm really interested in how that security belt in 2010 in the university, kind of a passive security belt, we could say. It remains passive for a long time. And then what is actually the tipping point when it starts to become kind of active acquisition of new territory? Is there really a tipping point with Ukraine, or what about Georgia and other cases? So where's the positive difference then in maybe 2020 when this happens? And the other question, the second one I have, is about this idea of maybe culture in it, because the security belt on that, yeah, I think it's that. You said it's against an invasion, and this invasion at the time, it was already then imagined as like an active invasion, or also like a cultural invasion, because it's universities. And actually, the campuses in 2014, they were placed at the same places, including Crimea, mirroring the same geographical belt. And again, here the question when the kind of passive belt transforms into an active aggression.
Thank you, Anna. I didn't mention this fact the other day at our discussion focused on your book, but it's a very acute observation you made about the same place or the same regions where different types of activities focused on the population and on the attachment of the population to the territory took place throughout at least 2 decades. And both camps, youth camps, which you were studying and which were not that ideological as the central Seliger one, are considering mostly the idea not to defend politically the minds of the young population, but mostly and simply to populate the depopulated territories. So the concept of the cultural policy, which was which was adopted in the 2014, was kind of cried out and laughed at because of some traditionalist, once again, reminiscences included in the text, like Russian culture should serve the security, the national security, something like that, which sounded completely ridiculous in 2014. But put together in the context and also to the previous concepts, because this one goes to 2008, 2009 and not to 2020. This gives sense to the fact that one of the goals of the Russian government, as for the demographic policy, was using of every cultural tool to develop the territory. And I hate to say that, but the rationality behind the kidnapping of Ukrainian children and also a part of the Ukrainian population, including the population living in the eastern regions of Ukraine, was not just to humiliate or to exterminate. It was to bring the new population and to recreate the security belt in the depopulated regions. And this is completely rational, but it's the mercantilist rationality, the colonial one, right? And from the point of view of the ideological turn, I would say that there was no a clear turn, because the ideologization or neo-traditionalization of the university, but also of the middle school agenda, high school agenda, was a continuous process which started at least in the late 2000s. Once again, in the same moment when, for example, anti-abortion campaigns were being funded by not only by church, but also by the local governments. And one of these anti-abortion theses corresponds quite well, once again, the rational core of these anti-abortion campaigns. It's not like blaming women, young women, or blaming men who do not care about their lost children, etc., but to produce more population in the depopulated regions. And it's not a surprise that the most active governments, regional governments, who invested among the first in these anti-abortion campaigns were, for example, the government of Krasnodar region, where we find one of the federal universities. So from this point of view, the patriotism, the nationalism, and the traditionalism were instrumental, much more than we were imagining in 2010s. It was implemented in order to assure the territorial integrity and the repopulation of the territory.
You had a question? Yeah.
Yes, thank you too. And thank you for your question, because it's exactly the direction I wanted to take, but on a lot more basic level. My knowledge is really, really basic about all this, and I was wondering about the connection of your economic part and the security belt part. I think I already got it now through your explanation, but this word security belt, why? Secure in what sense exactly? In what sense, and what are the practical consequences?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for pointing out this topic, which I slipped from in Anna's question. So the security was not considered in terms of direct military threat from the west or from the south, even though there were some concerns in the military doctrine. So there was a kind of division of labor in between different institutions of the Russian government, and the military guys were quite obsessed with the Chinese invasion or southern invasion. But those who were creating cultural policy and educational policy were more concerned about the Chinese settling in the in the eastern part of Russia and creating the enterprises. And the population, in the demographic sense, not in the sense of the competence, not in the sense of performance, so not in the sense of neoliberal efficiency, but in pure mercantilist sense, like being there and taking place there, was the main definition of the security in this case. And the cultural doctrine of the Russian Federation 2014 was stating quite clearly among the topics, among the targets, why this new cultural doctrine should be implemented in the sake of security was like the young population quits too quickly the regions where they are not attracted by cultural life, by city life, by urban facilities, etc. So we should invest in them in order to attach the younger population to the territory. That was the meaning of security in the cultural and educational sphere.
Okay, the back and then all. Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this enlightening talk, which gave a lot of thoughts about Russia. I have two questions. One is about what happened exactly, in your opinion, in the year 2011-12 for this shift or turnaround or reloading of the policies, because there could be an explanation that there is a new concept of Russian policy, or it was a reaction to the global financial crisis. Or maybe there's a third reason as well. And the second one is more basic. You were giving us the numbers of the gold, amount of gold. What's about silver, copper, rare earth?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. First of all, I have to sorry about not being explicit about 2011, 2012, because I was kind of keeping in mind that everyone has it in the memory or in the mind, but it's not true. So 2011, the end of 2011 and 2012 were marked by two major events. The first was Dmitry Medvedev was leaving his office, and Putin was taking the office in his place, and it was the huge collision about, like, was Putin legitimate in this case, right? And there were some troubles also within the administration, and there were some experts, some ministers, including Kudrin himself, who quit the administration or who were pushed off because of the discordance about the model of succession. And the second event was not the financial crisis or any kind of economic crisis, but the crisis of legitimacy, because the December of 2011, in case or in the context of the parliamentary elections, they were the first huge mass street rally or protest in Moscow and some other large cities since the 20 last years. So the reply of the Kremlin's office to this protest was clearly conservative, and some measures I showed you in the beginning here were subjugated by this crisis. Some neoconservative replies were directly applied to that, including the case of Pussy Riot, for example, and the rigidified legislation about public manifestations, etc. But what was also in charge, for example, Vladislav Surkov's model of governed democracy or sovereign democracy was kind of reversed by this protestation, by citizen protest, because it showed that the well-governed opposition is not governed so well.
Thank you.
Oh yes, it's true. And about the resources, unfortunately I didn't count the silver and copper and some other important goods in the cellars of the Bank of Russia or other facilities. But you're totally right. We need to have a larger audit of these resources, including those who are excluded from the list of sanctions, which is quite impressive, once again, when you think about maintaining the war economy of Russia, where the rare metals, for example, the copper and some other strategic resources, are still being circulating in the free market. So they are not subject to the mercantilist limitations, as well as the sanctions coming from the free world to the kind of closed world. That doesn't work like that. And we really need to take into account how it works in order to understand better the next state of the international economy based on these strategic resources. I agree with you, but I have no clear answer.
Thank you so much for very inspiring speech. I have a question. It's like really simple. Describing Russian version of mercantilism, you were addressed to attributes like colonialism, traditionalism, and very old-fashioned rationality, which is, I would say, anachronistic. So what is new in this version of mercantilism, which actually like 4 or even 5 centuries old?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good and very sensitive question. I'm afraid I don't have a clear answer once again, because every treat which is normally considered like, look, that never happened. That's not true. It happened, but not like 20 years before. It happened like 200 years before. And this is something which is completely disorientating, right? Because many experts just don't consider history of long term in many respects. And from this point of view, even the neoliberal agenda, which instigates the managed inequalities, is something which is not that new from some extent, right? Starting from the labor houses, from the poor labor in the United Kingdom of the 17th century, and coming up to the ways the population, the deported populations are managed on the territories, which is an agenda existing from at least 18th century in the English, in the British, Empire, and then in the French Empire. So I would say that some elements are really kind of the turning back of the refoulé of the suppressed, of the historically suppressed forms of economic and social existence. But still, I would say that I missed this part of the consequences for the Russian population and for the Ukrainian population too. And one of the important elements of this new is the lacking definition of the Russian nation. Because in many respects, what is called Russification, what is called the kind of remaking Ukrainians a new Russians, is not based on the blood thesis. It's not based on the racial or eugenic ideas which were reigning the mercantilist era starting from the 17th century. If you look closer at the relevant documents, like for example the report on the activities on the presidential ombudsperson for children's rights of the Russian Federation, you find the list of the measures of the Russification of the Ukrainian children which are brought to the Russian territory. And once again, this sounds like just crazy that this is the ombudsperson who is in charge of the Russification of the children, right? It must be more or less the contrary. But still, if we took it seriously, we discover that there is no eugenic or organic justification of what the Russification might mean. This is a completely, how to say it, not really light, but still very, very constructivist idea of the nation, which includes only the fact that the Russification, turning Ukrainian children into Russians, means they know how the institutions work in Russia, and they speak Russian better than they spoke before. How to use yeah, that's it. But also, but also like how the presidential election work, because when they become the electors, they need to know how these specific Russian democracy functions, right? So as you see, this is more or less all. There is no like making them approve something, making them, no, this is kind of civic education. We just fill in the ranks of the Russian citizen. And if you look at other speeches and proposals of this ombudsperson, she insists on the fact, doubling the Vladimir Putin's narration, that even in the Russian territory, even disregarding the Ukrainian children or the Ukrainian displaced population, one of the most important questions in the Russian schools is the language issue. So people who study in Russian schools should just not to pollute the Russian language, and those who come from the immigration families should know it well in order not to corrupt the good Russian language of the Russian children. So it's quite interesting from one point of view, because there is no essentialism in the Russian nationalism for the moment. And that might be considered as a new feature.
Okay, we have just a couple of minutes for the last question. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the presentation. So today Putin has met for the second time since he got re-elected with the Russian Union of Manufacturers and Entrepreneurs, right? Which is a general convention of the Russian capitalist class, and which is more than he met with his own government since the election, which is 0, more than the military, which is 0, more than FSB, which is 1, and more than with the Security Council, which is on the one devoted to the terrorist attack. So this brings me to the understanding that these people are still hugely important for the Russian leadership, at least for communication of some messages too, right? So my question would be, what is the role devoted to these people in the scheme you are explaining?
That's a good question. I think I started exploring the scheme, this model, from the most public expressions of economic and political and educational cultural policy in Russia, in Russian institutional model. So this is a bit difficult for me to explain, to answer directly your question about the precise place of these actors in the system today. I would say I need more material, right? And this is not the easiest task to get material about what is happening now in the corridors of Kremlin or in the corridors of different institutions. But still, I would say that we may try to take a lateral answer to this question. Like, for example, once again, looking in the way the so-called private company by Prigozhin was constructed, to discover that these people, like Prigozhin, like Gabrielyanov, like some others, are no more oligarchs in the sense we knew in the Yeltsin era, right? So they're not just private investors who invest in state structures in order to lower the risk of investment, in order to profit from the security given by the state institutions. These are the persons which are also known in the mercantilist era, in France especially, and which are called les fermiers généraux, the general farmers, who were people getting subsidiary contracts from the state to fulfill the state functions. Meanwhile, they were private ones. So I would say that we should perceive the Russian state structure not at all in terms of the straight opposition between state and private. We should now understand that 3 decades which passed from the start of this commodification of the state apparatus brought to the effect that private state or private public cooperation is no more in one highly regulated and well-defined legislative sector. It's now everywhere in the state, right? And we should maybe consider also these personnel or these actors as actors of this private-public field in which they have new functions.
Okay. Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for the question, and please subscribe to our website, IGRec.io. The next event will be online, that will organized by Institute, and on May 14th, we'll have a roundtable on contemporary conservatism, and there will be announcement on the website, and so more things will come out in Berlin. So.
Just a moment, for those of you who read Russian, I think this is the most part of you. There are two texts which may give you more details about this type of analysis I proposed today. So this is a publication in the review Gorby, which you see the title on the screen. And then there was a collection of texts, перед лицом катастрофы, where I published an account analyzing how the neoconservative ideology took place within state structures. So the mercantilist account taken not in economic sense, which is mostly considered in this text, but in a cultural sense. Thank you, and thank you very much.